Hey, so recently for DLF, part of a series I write every week in the off-season, looking at ranks and trying to find edges for our Dynasty League, I ended up looking at Scott Fishbowl ADP. I found 4 really interesting areas when comparing Scott Fishbowl ADP to Dynasty ADP, especially their position ranks, and I want to talk about them a little bit. So essentially, because the Scott Fishbowl is such a unique scoring format, it doesn't compare directly to redraft and it doesn't compare directly to Dynasty. However, the position ranks does give us an insight into where this groupthink of all this fantasy muscle are on positional tiers and players in general. And since the scoring format for Scott Fishbowl basically just escalates scoring, and within the positions there isn't a large drastic change. It's not like suddenly Dalton Schultz is better than Travis Kelce, or that Daniel Jones is getting penalized for interceptions and therefore isn't a top 12 quarterback. It just escalates everyone to greater or lesser degrees. So the positional ranks should be fairly applicable. So the first thing I did was I looked at the positional ranks for Scott Fishbowl, and then I compared them directly to Dynasty League Football ADP. Now, the basic changes are what you'd expect. Dynasty dislikes the older players in the different tiers that you can create using positional ranks. So at running back, it doesn't like Christian McCaffrey and Saquon Barkley as much, because they're older and Dynasty players are obsessed with that. And at wide receiver, they didn't like Tyreek Hill and Stephon Diggs in that thick tier of wide receiver ones because they're older and they're not as young as CeeDee Lamb or as young as Justin Jefferson or Jamar Chase. And so that's where the difference was showing up. Not a lot of new observations there. So what I did from there is I ran on to rankers, because the idea of looking at ranks is that ADP does a certain good job, but if rankers are doing any good, which you would hope they are, and they're meant to provide you an edge over ADP. So I compared the positional ranks of ranks compared to Scott Fishbowl, and then again compared to DLF ADP. Pretty natural question, so I probably should have thought about it straight away, is that the differences between the DLF ADP and the DLF ranks are different when compared straight to Scott Fishbowl. But where are rankers less scared of that and less interested in the younger players, or perhaps more interested in the older players, despite that, when you compare DLF ADP and ranks relative to this source of redraft ADP? I mean, I just put you to sleep with those sentences, right? What we need, I decided, was a graph. I know, I'm radical new thinking to use a graph to plot players. So here's what popped up. What you can see in the top left, those are players that DLF rankers, despite being lower on than Scott Fishbowl ADP or the redraft source, are higher on than regular Dynasty ADP. So those are players that rankers are suggesting we should be much more interested in for their points, despite their value concern, that they might lose value or get injured and then no longer be viable Dynasty assets. But rankers are suggesting their points are worth more than that potential value risk. So if you're a team that needs points and can afford risking that value a little bit, then you should target Christian McCaffrey, Nick Chubb, Austin Eckler, Stephon Diggs, and Tyreek Hill. So diagonally opposite, right here also. Those are players that DLF is suggesting that their risk is actually greater than their upside, because for the opposite reasons, despite the fact they are preferencing them more than redraft ADP, they're also below average compared to DLF ADP. So players on that second list, Jahmyr Gibbs, which was a weird one for me, but my ranks are in there and it kind of comes out with the same result, because I think his upside might be slightly lower than redraft expects, because I see him more of the more expensive DeAndre Swift, who never quite hit the top 12 for an entire season, and David Montgomery is a little underrated in that offense, in my opinion. You also got Jonathan Taylor, which is also odd. He's one of the few good young running backs, but he's also entering a more uncertain situation, with the quarterback having to develop. Relatively rare that we see a lot of success early in a quarterback's career, at least in their rookie year. And also he's a rushing quarterback who, if he does hit even his ceiling, is going to take opportunities away from some part of that skill position depth chart. So that could be a concern with Jonathan Taylor. He's also entering that period where he's about to be considered part of the old guard of running back. So without a difference-making season, it's going to be really hard for him to keep that value. Remember, Nick Chubb and Christian McCaffrey and Saquon Barkley were on that list the last couple of years. And because of injuries and then gradually aging into the age range that Jonathan Taylor's about to go into, they have become less certain in dynasty value. And Jonathan Taylor's right there, so it kind of makes sense he's on that list too. Next, you've got CeeDee Lamb, which I completely agree with, because even though he was a top 12 wide receiver last year, and I called that, and young, and very good, and on a great team, and got a good quarterback, I think we've mostly seen his ceiling. And so I don't see a lot of value increases. He's probably at this level of value for quite a long time, and so I don't think his points are going to pay off at the value you're looking to get him at, and that's what this list is really about. And the last one on that list is Dalton Kincaid, highest drafted tight end in this draft class, in a really interesting tight end draft class, but not necessarily the best. And also we see even good seasons from tight ends drafted in the first round don't necessarily equate to an increase in value in dynasty ranks. I'm thinking Evan Ingram and Kyle Pitts are our two greatest examples, who have both had really good first years, and yet because they were so high valued and they were tight ends, and those tight ends relatively rarely have Travis Kelce-like seasons, even when they have great rookie seasons, there's not a lot of places for their value to go. So even if he does produce as the best tight end from this class this year, there's not a lot of place that his value can go. Like, it's not going to be a Travis Kelce season, so the hype slowly fades, especially over an entire offseason next year. So it kind of makes sense he's on this list too. The other quadrant, the top right, value is greater than their points. So in other words, even though Dynasty ADP is lower on them compared to redraft, rankers are suggesting we should be more interested in them than Dynasty ADP, because even though they probably won't score as many points as Dynasty ADP is suggesting, because redraft ADP disagrees, and that's probably better at points. It is, on average, better at points. But they are worth it because their value is so solid, given their profiles. Travis Etienne, Ken Walker, Jalen Waddle, and Kyle Pitts. And so there's relatively little risk, relative to their position as well, moving forward. And they should produce enough this year, because they're still fairly high ranked in redraft, that they'll sustain value, and their value window is a little longer. And that fits, I think, both Jalen Waddle, Kyle Pitts, Ken Walker, despite what happened in the draft, and Travis Etienne. I think that makes sense. If you're on a team that's looking to increase in value and yet still stay competitive, I think that's a good list of players to explore it. You could pay. One last one. Bottom left, their upside is greater than their risk. So these are players that Dynasty ADP and ranks expect are going to drop in value soon, but their upside makes it worth it. Not necessarily their points, because redraft ADP is also, or in this case Scott Fishbowl ADP, is also a little uncertain. You'll notice this is the smallest and least populated area. There's not a lot of players that Dynasty rankers want to bet on purely for their upside, despite the fact that their value has a great deal of risk in it as well. But there are a couple, even if they're quite close to the line. Cooper Kupp, Derrick Henry, Keenan Allen. All three have either lost all the value that they've had, or they're about to. You can also look at this graph and maybe see some other names that stick out to you, but most other players are existing in a relative clump. Anyway, I'll link the article down below. I published the research on Patreon as well. And yeah, you can look at the graph all you want, or ask me questions about it down below. I thought it was a really interesting way of using two sources of really sharp ADP to look for ways of exploring potential values in Dynasty, if you clearly understand where your team is and what kind of assets or what kind of players you might be more likely or find more value in chasing. But let me know what you think. Thanks for checking out the video, and I'll see you in the next one.